Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we look at Ecuador, where large-scale protests have erupted over the government's decision to scrap diesel subsidies. In Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we cover the second round of nationwide strikes in France, heightened tensions between Russia and NATO, Israel's ground offensive in Gaza City, and elections in Malawi that could trigger unrest. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine student-led protests in Timor-Leste and the rise of Gen Z protest movements across the region. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where protests in Ecuador have erupted over the government's removal of diesel subsidies. The demonstrations started in Quito on September 12th, after the government's decision to scrap a $1.1 billion diesel subsidy led to a sharp rise in fuel prices. Protest actions have included strikes and road blockades, including one that disrupted the Pan American North Highway just outside Quito. In the capital itself, protesters have clashed with police near the Carondelet National Palace. On September 13th, President Daniel Noboa announced that the presidency would be temporarily relocated from Quito to Latacunga. Then, on September 16th, the government imposed a 60-day state of emergency across 7 provinces. The measure grants additional powers to police and security forces to proactively break up public gatherings. It also suspends freedom of assembly and enforces curfews. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Fuel subsidies have been in place in Ecuador since the 1970s, and previous attempts to reform them have consistently triggered strong public backlash. This was the case in both 2019 and 2022, when unrest effectively forced the governments of Moreno and Lasso to reverse course on similar reforms. President Noboa likely judges that his move to scrap the subsidies will also be met with rising unrest. The decision to shift the presidency from Quito to the much smaller city of Latacunga underscores how the government is preparing for a prolonged period of protests and how it believes it can ultimately outlast the protesters' resolve. The subsidy-related protests are likely to add further pressure to Ecuador's already fragile political situation, where multiple protest movements are being led by different civil society groups. These include labor union demonstrations, with organizations such as the United Workers' Front recently staging protests over medicine shortages and poor working conditions. Environmental groups have also mobilized against the government's decision to grant new mining concessions. At the same time, the state of emergency declared in response to the unrest could further strain relations with the Constitutional Court, which has already opposed several of President Noboa's proposed reforms aimed at tackling the country's powerful organized criminal groups. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where France has entered the second round of nationwide strikes. On September 18th, the second wave of the Bloquons tout, or Let's Shut Everything Down, strikes began across the country. Unlike the first round, which started online before later gaining the backing of France's main unions, this latest action has been directly organized and led by the unions themselves. Estimates suggest that more than 400,000 people were expected to take part on September 18th, though some forecasts place total turnout closer to 1 million. The first wave of strikes on September 10th saw more than 400 separate protest actions recorded across France. These included road blockades and barricades, acts of sabotage against infrastructure, and the occupation of university and school campuses. More than 500 people were arrested, and around 50 were injured, including about 30 police officers. By late morning on September 18th, French police and media were reporting protests in major cities, including Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, along with at least 40 road blockades. Several dozen people were arrested, including 22 in Marseille alone. Now, our team's assessment. With stronger coordination and the active involvement of France's major labor unions, the September 18th protests turned out to be larger than the first wave on September 10th. The main disruptions were caused by organized unrest, though there were also incidents of direct action, including sabotage of transport infrastructure, which led to significant travel and service disruptions. While the protests remained largely peaceful, they did escalate into some clashes between demonstrators and police, posing risks to bystanders. The September 10th protests, though drawing a large turnout, were almost certainly less politically impactful than organizers had hoped. This was likely due to the lack of a clear leadership structure and the fall of the Bayrou government 2 days earlier, which removed the immediate threat of the Prime Minister's austerity plan, a major driver of the unrest. By contrast, the September 18th demonstrations are proving more politically influential. The new Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, has yet to clarify whether he will continue with Bayrou's austerity reforms or instead seek cooperation with the left. His unilateral decision to scrap one of his predecessor's most unpopular proposals, the repeal of 2 national holidays, almost certainly signals openness to cooperation, but it also reveals significant political weakness. Protesters may well capitalize on that weakness to press for further concessions. Staying in the region, tensions between Russia and NATO are at their highest in years following the Zapad 2025 exercises and a drone incursion into Romania. Between September 12th and 16th, Russia and Belarus carried out large-scale military drills under the Zapad 2025 Joint Strategic Exercise, which Minsk and Moscow said were designed to test combat readiness. According to the Belarusian Defense Ministry, around 1,000 Russian personnel took part alongside 7,000 Belarusian troops. Dignitaries from 23 countries attended, including China, North Korea, and Iran, as well as representatives from NATO members Hungary, Turkey, and the United States. On September 13th, a Russian drone reportedly entered the airspace of NATO member Romania. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the drone crossed about 10 kilometers beyond the Romanian border and spent roughly 50 minutes inside NATO territory before turning back towards Ukraine. Romanian air defenses did not engage the aircraft. Amid the heightened tensions caused by such drone incursions, Poland's State Protection Service neutralized a quadcopter drone flying over sensitive government sites, including the presidential palace in Warsaw, on September 15th. 2 individuals were detained, a Ukrainian man and a Belarusian woman. Investigators later reported no evidence of foreign intelligence involvement. Russian forces have continued aerial strikes, where a one-way attack drone directly struck the National Pharmaceutical University. At the same time, Ukraine has sustained its drone campaign against Russian oil and gas infrastructure. On September 14th, Ukrainian forces launched at least 361 drones, setting fire to the Kurishi oil refinery in Leningrad Oblast. Then, on September 16th, they hit the Saratov oil refinery in Saratov Oblast. Now, our intelligence assessment. Tensions between NATO members in Eastern Europe and Russia remain high following the Russian drone incursion into Poland on September 9th to 10th. Coming immediately before the Zapad 2025 exercises, the incursions almost certainly pushed border tensions to their highest point since 2022. During the drills, Poland deployed up to 40,000 troops along the frontier. Zapad means West, referring to the primarily NATO-facing Western theater. The war games, usually held every 4 years, are often used by the Kremlin as a demonstration of strength. This year's Zapad exercise, however, was markedly smaller than in the past. This almost certainly reflects Russian manpower shortages, the loss of key equipment, and the lack of a well-trained strategic reserve, with most capable units already deployed to Ukraine. Back in September 2021, The Kremlin highly likely used the Zapad Games as preparation for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and as cover for the mass movement of forces. Around 200,000 personnel are thought to have taken part in those drills. The Romanian drone incursion is not necessarily a sign of a new tactic by Moscow. This contrasts with the highly likely intentional incursions into Poland, which were probably designed to test NATO's resolve, its defensive capabilities, and its reaction times. There have already been numerous incidents of Russian drones both violating Romanian airspace and crashing near Romanian villages. But on this occasion, the drone flew in and out of Romanian territory without crashing, which likely indicates the incursion was intentional rather than the result of a malfunction or electronic interference. What is striking is how differently Bucharest responded compared to previous cases. Both Warsaw and Bucharest have, in the past, appeared to play down the significance of Russian drone incursions, which have occurred on a semi-regular basis since 2022. This time, however, Romania's defense ministry issued a strong condemnation of the Russian Federation, saying the incident represents a new challenge to regional security and stability in the Black Sea. A few days after the incursion, Romania's Prosecutor General released findings that claimed the country had been the target of substantial Russian interference operations during the 2024 presidential election. The Kremlin has almost certainly carried out a long-running campaign of clandestine operations against NATO members, including election interference. These operations are typically designed to stay below the threshold of direct confrontation. Drone incursions, however, stand out as a Russian tactic because they carry a far greater risk of miscalculation and escalation if they continue. Recent long-range strikes likely show that Russian forces are continuing to target symbolic civilian buildings. President Zelensky announced that in just the past 2 weeks, Russia has launched more than 3,500 drones, 2,500 glide bombs, and 200 missiles at targets in Ukraine. The threat environment in Ukrainian cities is now at its highest since the early stages of the full-scale invasion. Russian long-range attacks against urban centers are almost certain to continue in the short term and are likely to escalate as worsening weather conditions impede ground offensives, with the mud season typically beginning in October. Meanwhile, Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil infrastructure have been highly effective, almost certainly delivering a tangible blow to the Kremlin's war economy. Oil revenues are a key center of gravity for Russia's war effort. Most critically, they have enabled Moscow to expand its manpower by offering financial incentives without resorting to the politically costly step of forced conscription. There is a realistic possibility that sustained disruption to this sector will undermine Russia's ability to attract new recruits as financial incentives become less viable. Moving on to the Middle East, where Israel has launched a ground offensive in Gaza City, driving further humanitarian concerns. On September 16th, the Israel Defense Forces officially declared the entirety of Gaza City a combat zone, urging all remaining residents to evacuate to the Al-Mawasi humanitarian area further south. Plans for an offensive and occupation of Gaza City had been under discussion within the Israeli cabinet for weeks in August. In the days leading up to the latest move, Israeli forces carried out several raids on the city's outskirts, along with intensified airstrikes on suspected Hamas positions. According to the IDF, around 350,000 Palestinians have already left Gaza City. 2 divisions are currently engaged in the offensive. On September 17th, the Palestinian Telecommunications Regulatory Authority, based in the West Bank, announced that the destruction of telecoms infrastructure in northern Gaza had cut off internet and telephone services in Gaza City. That same day, Israeli officials said they would reopen Salah al-Din Street, one of the main roads through central and southern Gaza, for 48 hours to speed up civilian evacuations. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Although the offensive was formally launched on September 16th, Israeli operations in Gaza City had already been underway for weeks. and the IDF has secured much of the city's western districts. The aim of the offensive is likely to restrict what remains of Hamas's freedom of movement and to drive them out of their last underground and above-ground positions. The operation will almost certainly worsen the humanitarian situation for Palestinians still in Gaza City, and it is also expected to add to the overcrowding in the Al-Mawasi zone. The offensive has the potential to complicate Israel's stated war aims, freeing the surviving hostages and defeating Hamas. Strikes near Hamas strongholds in the city will highly likely put the hostages at risk, either by raising the chance of friendly fire or by forcing Israeli units to carry out smaller-scale ground operations against suspected Hamas positions. Such actions would almost certainly increase Israeli casualties. It is also highly likely that Hamas fighters displaced from Gaza City will attempt to infiltrate the Al-Mawasi zone, further undermining the already fragile security situation there. The offensive is highly likely to trigger large-scale protests, both in Israel and abroad. In Israel, the families of the hostages, who are an influential political force with backing from the opposition, are expected to call for further mass demonstrations. These protests will likely cause major disruption in Tel Aviv. Large European cities such as London, Barcelona, Brussels, and Paris are also expected to see sizable protests opposing the offensive, particularly between September 18th and 20th. Now, moving to Malawi, where elections have raised fears of fraud allegations and possible civil unrest. On September 16th, Malawians went to the polls to elect the president, members of parliament, and local councillors. According to the Electoral Commission, turnout was just 51%, down from 64% in 2020. While 17 candidates are officially in the running, the contest is seen as a race between the incumbent, Lazarus Chakwera, and his predecessor, Peter Mutharika. Both men have faced accusations of cronyism and corruption. Chakwera has campaigned on fixing the economy and restoring confidence in government, while Mutharika has focused on promises of infrastructure investment. Now, for our team's assessment. The elections take place against a backdrop of prolonged petrol shortages, regular power cuts, a rising cost of living, hunger, poverty, inequality, and high youth unemployment. The economic crisis has been made worse by environmental disasters such as Cyclone Freddy, which killed more than 1,200 people and destroyed much of Malawi's farmland. At the same time, widespread perceptions of corruption have fueled voter apathy and dissatisfaction. According to the regional polling institute Afrobarometer, nearly 80% of Malawians believe that some or most politicians are corrupt. Only half consider the last elections to have been free and fair, and just 40% are satisfied with the state of the country's democracy, down from 53% a decade ago. Given the widespread mistrust in Malawi's electoral process, there is a realistic possibility that the results will be met with accusations of rigging from losing parties and their supporters. Such claims could spark civil unrest. After the 2019 general elections, many Malawians alleged electoral fraud and took part in widespread protests across the country. The demonstrations triggered a harsh response from security forces, who used live ammunition and other violent crowd control measures to disperse crowds. If large-scale anti-government demonstrations break out again, security forces are highly likely to respond in a similar way, a move that could further inflame the protests. Finally, we move to Asia-Pacific, where student-led protests in Timor-Leste have forced concessions from Parliament, setting the stage for more Gen Z protest movements across the region. On September 15th and 16th, demonstrations broke out in the capital, Dili, over a controversial government plan to purchase 65 new Toyota Prado SUVs for all members of Parliament. The protests began peacefully, but by September 15th, around 1,000 demonstrators had gathered outside the National Parliament building. They threw projectiles, and riot police responded with tear gas to disperse the crowds. The following day, the protests grew to around 2,000 participants. Demonstrators reportedly burned tires and again threw projectiles, prompting riot police to once more use tear gas. In response to the protests, Timor-Leste's parliament convened on September 16th and voted to cancel the controversial vehicle purchase plan. The main student activist organization behind the demonstrations, the Estudiante Universitario de Timor-Leste, or EUTL, broadened its demands to include the abolition of lifetime pension benefits for MPs, among other reforms. On September 17th, the group announced it would immediately end the protests, after receiving commitments from parliamentary leaders to address several of its demands. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. While the plan to buy new vehicles triggered the unrest, deeper socio-economic grievances, including perceptions of corruption, inequality, and stalled development, almost certainly galvanized the protests into a broader reform movement. The rapid concessions granted by Parliament have likely averted the immediate threat of further protests in Dili. But in the longer term, these concessions set a strong precedent for demonstrations to quickly and effectively achieve results. This will likely encourage Timorese student groups, particularly the EUTL, to mobilize again in future, given that many of the underlying socio-economic issues are highly likely to persist. In addition, one of the EUTL's demands accepted by Parliament was a review of the law on freedom of assembly and demonstrations. That could ultimately limit the ability of riot police to suppress future unrest. Gen Z-led protest movements are almost certainly gaining momentum across Asia. In early September, Gen Z protests in Nepal brought down the government after demonstrators set fire to the Parliament building. In Indonesia, student-led protests that began in late August, partly in response to a proposed hike in housing subsidies for MPs, triggered severe civil unrest. Largely driven by social media, Gen Z and student-led movements against corruption in Asia are highly likely to keep growing across the region. They are fueled by rising frustrations over corruption, worsening economic inequality, limited job opportunities, and disillusionment with traditional political elites. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.